And joining us now on the debate, Tim Wu, author of The Master Switch, Matthew Ingram, senior writer at GigaOM, Jesse Hirsch, the internet strategist, and the other Jesse, Jesse Brown, host of TVO's Search Engine. Actually, I don't know, did I just insult you? Maybe you're the real Jesse, he's the other Jesse?
We're both the other Jesse.
You're both the other, okay.
I'm still looking for the real one.
Gentlemen, let me read something from Wired Magazine's Chris Anderson, whom you all know, on this issue of whether the web is dead. Here we go, Michael. Let's bring this up if we can. Over the past few years, one of the most important shifts in the digital world has been the move from the wide open web to semi-closed platforms that use the internet for transport, but not the browser for display. It's driven primarily by the rise of the iPhone model of mobile computing, and it's a world Google can't crawl, one where HTML doesn't rule. Okay, let's pick this apart and see if we can figure this out. Tim, how is it possible that the web is obsolete?
Well, it's not quite that it's everything that was once new is going to be old. And the real point to understand is that the web is just one of many internet applications. Before the web, there are other applications. There were Gopher, there was Veronica, there was all these things that no one's ever heard of. The web came along. It's had its decade or so, maybe more, but its popularity is starting to fade.
Its popularity is starting to fade?
Yeah, well, the thing is that, as I said, it's only one of many possible applications. And you may notice if you use a smartphone, you often end up using other applications more than the web itself. And so, you know, just like anything like an old amusement park or something, it just isn't quite as popular as it used to be.
Do you want to make the distinction, Matt, between the internet and the web? Because I think these terms get used interchangeably, and they ought not to be.
Yeah, and I think Tim made a good point. The internet is what underlies all of those things, the web and everything else that moves on top of it. So we're most familiar with the web because we use browsers and we go to websites and so on, but there's a whole lot of plumbing underneath that the web relies on. And what I think is interesting about the application world is, to me, those apps are like little mini browsers. So instead of just having one browser that takes you everywhere, you've got little sort of function-specific browsers. So you want to go and look at restaurant reviews, you use that little app. So it's just a miniature browser that takes you to a specific place.
How many apps have you got?
I've got about 170, maybe 180.
You use them all?
No.
So what do you got them for?
I like to have a lot of apps.
You like
just
to have a lot of apps.
Well, and I try them out, you know, to see which one's better.
Okay. Jesse Brown, you got any apps?
I have a few apps.
Yeah. Like what?
I have a Gmail app that I often will abandon because it's not as functional as the actual website. A lot of these apps are dumbed down versions of the actual websites.
True, yeah.
And I got to say, I just don't buy the concept of this article at all. I mean, and Wired has a bad track record, I got to tell you, in terms of declaring things dead. They've declared the CPU dead. They've declared Wi-Fi dead. They've declared Garfield the cat dead for some reason. They love declaring things dead. I guess it's a nice way to sell magazines, but any way you look at it, if you want to judge it in terms of bandwidth, the amount of actual file transfers, the amount of web pages, the amount of time we spend on the web, the amount of people on the web, it's up. It's just not so. It's healthier than it's ever been. There are other things happening as well in increasing. It's about the proportion of internet traffic that the web represents. That's changing. But this is sort of an outlandish, kind of sensationalistic claim that the web is dead.
Jesse?
I think, too, the other issue is velocity. That rather than thinking about what's dead, we're looking at what's out front. And while the internet has always been synonymized with a very fast speed, the web is slowing down because the rest of society is making use of it. But applications continue to appear as the vanguard, continue to appear at the forefront of the wave because early adopters are using it. But the Pew Internet Research Project, for example, just came out with numbers that show really only a small fraction of the population and even a small fraction of smartphone users actually use apps. Apps are getting a lot of attention, but the web, I think, is maturing in a way that reflects both its diversity in terms of users, that granted, maybe it's not as fast, maybe it's not at the forefront of digital media, but it's not going away and it's certainly not dying.
Tim?
Yeah, I was going to say there's a deeper conflict here, and it's between not just the web and apps, but between the computer platform and the telephone platform, or the smartphone platform. And these are two devices that actually are quite different. And the truth is, the web, I agree with Jesse, the web is still the champion, the king of the computer platform. But the thing is, on the phone, if you use your phone, you use apps a lot more often. And so what's going on here is actually a very deep battle between the computer and the telephone, one that actually has been going on for about 20 years or so, going back to the 80s, going back to the early days of AT&T and the internet researchers, and it's resurging in a new form between the computer platform and the telephone or smartphone platform.
And good church, yes.
Yeah.
Well, along with that, I think the deeper relevance is also a battle that is being sort of inflicted upon us between open and closed. And I think we risk getting a little bit gearheady here. Is this about the web or is this about apps? Well, who cares? I think what really matters here is whether or not we're going to shift from the wide open internet where anybody can build a site, where anyone can do business, where innovation rules, to a proprietary closed system. Which is why I take such umbrage at Wired's story, because it's not as if they don't have a dog in that fight. Here we have Wired telling us that the web is dead. Wired is selling a magazine app that gives you the same content you can get for free on their website. Wired and its parent company, Condé Nast, would like very much, as a lot of other big stakeholders would like very much, that everybody shift to apps, which there's a consumer behavior where we're more used to paying for apps than we are for web content.
But again, I want to make sure, just for those who aren't as app happy or tech savvy as all of you guys here, do you have apps?
I have apps, yeah.
How many you got?
Probably about 20, and I use probably 5, I'd say.
For
Yeah.
example, to do what?
Foursquare. Foursquare is a great. It's an app that you tell people where you are. So you're at a cafe, and you're using your phone, and it tells people I'm at Grounded Cafe in New York.
Why would you want people to know that?
Well, sometimes you don't.
Okay.
But occasionally you might want your friends to come visit you or something. Sometimes if you're out drinking, for example, you might want to find your friends, that kind of thing.
Okay.
It's a great app.
You got apps, Jesse?
I also only have maybe a dozen, maybe 15 tops, and I probably use maybe 4 or 5. One of the big apps I use a lot actually is the National Film Boards app. Partly because there's a ton of great public video content that, sure, I could find on the web, but it's kind of another way of watching TV, that I take my iPad, I flip open the NFB, and I go watch the October Crisis, or go watch great Canadian cinema.
Is that all free?
It's all free, and it's not the web, but it's not exclusive to the web. I'd say most of the time, and maybe I'm an advanced user, I'm actually using the web a lot on my smartphone because I'm using the type of mobile browser that makes it a little easier to use. And I think that where we're focusing on apps now, I think the web is going to have a resurgence when it becomes easier to use on this different platform.
Well, I think one thing we can all agree on here is that you have far too many apps, and you need to get rid of probably 90% of them sometime by the end of the day. Because you can't possibly use 180 apps, right?
I don't. There's no question. I probably use maybe half a dozen. But I have to try everything out, I write about this.
But what's being revealed here is that apps are not as versatile as the web, because we use applications that are embedded on the web all the time, and we don't think of it as 100 different apps. You just surf between 100 different sites without even noticing that you've moved. You got to exit an app, you got to exit a closed system, enter another system when you want to switch from one app to the next. And the reality that is described in the Wired piece of us, you wake up in the morning, you use one app to check the weather, you use another app to do this, you use another app to do that. You've been using the internet all day, but you haven't used the web.
Right.
That doesn't describe the life of anyone here, and we're probably, we probably have more apps than your average gang.
Do you want to just take a second, and because you've used this expression a couple of times, the concept of open versus closed refers to what?
This goes back to, I think, the origins of computing, which is essentially, if you can't take it apart and if you can't hack it, if you can't mod it, you don't own it. And this is an ethos that was built into, Steve Wozniak built it into the first Apple computers, and it's what made the internet the internet. It's what made Google Google, that any company can come out of a garage and innovate. That a series of open standards rather, allow anyone to come onto this platform. Now, this has made the web explode in popularity. This has been a boon to mankind in many ways, but it's also been difficult to monetize because, unlike the old media paradigm, you don't have a few companies running the show and setting prices and setting standards.
It's Wild West, right? Anybody?
Yeah.
That's right. Now, that does not mean that billions of dollars haven't been made off of it or that there aren't viable economies, but that money is spread it's distributed between a lot more players than the old media world. So there's a lot of interest in going back.
Jesse,
putting
then
the
I
clock
think
back.
it's also what Jesse's emphasizing is, the web and the internet is not always about economics. So if the internet is a type of cultural ecosystem, then open is one of its strongest viruses, up there with free. And these two viruses infect anything that touches the internet. So that might be business plans, that might be cultural approaches, that might be politics.
why do you call it a virus? Because I think that suggests pejorative, and I think a lot of people appreciate the fact that it's free and open.
I certainly wouldn't use the pejorative, but I would use the infectious rate, that these are infectious ideas. And what you're starting to see is an inability to immunize yourself against these infectious ideas. So closed systems always try to invade this ecosystem But the open virus, the free virus, continues to flourish, and that's why there's these tensions consistently.
Tim, then Matt.
Yeah, this open-closed divide that everyone's talking, it's pretty fundamental if you want to understand the long history of computing. In my book that's coming out in November, this cycle goes through in every industry. It goes through, media go through open phases, closed phases, and so forth. And you can see a divide right now. It's very obvious. It's the same divide as this computer-telephone divide I talked about later. And when you read in the news about a war between Google and Apple, sometimes it's actually a war between open and closed underneath it. What's interesting is Apple, which, as you pointed out, invented the open computer, has now almost converted to the closed side. And they're allied very carefully with Hollywood and the entertainment industries and the phone companies, all of which prefer the closed view of the world because that's been their business model for
They understand how
decades.
to make money off
Yeah,
that.
they understand. It's the best way for content makers to make money and the best way for phone companies to make money. And so that is the fundamental divide, and I think it's crucial to understanding this issue.
Matthew.
And I think another thing to understand is that Apple, I mean, it's very seductive. Their closed system, that walled garden or whatever, and all the apps and the phone and everything is hugely appealing because you get a standard sort of user behavior. If you get an Android device that's open and Google gives it to you and you can do whatever you want with it and you can hack it, well, the thing breaks half of the time. You know, you can't figure out how to download the patch that gets you to do something.
Android device is
a phone that uses an open operating system from Google. So that's the.
Does everybody know that except me?
A lot of people do. Okay. So that's the open.
I'm trying. I really am trying, guys.
That's the open model, right? Okay. Put anything you want on there, do whatever you want with it. Apple's is the closed model, but the reason why Apple sells so many devices is that it's very, very attractive. They make the user experience just incredibly good, and so people they offer, please let me into your walled garden. Please don't let me do anything else except what you can do on your device.
Let me follow up with Jesse Brown on this. Recent article in The Economist suggested the trend to more closed systems is undeniable. You agree?
I know that there are a lot of efforts to make that happen, but I can't agree that that's the trend. I read recently, how do journalists count to 3? 1, 2, trend. This is not necessarily the trend. There are cycles, and I think that, to pick up on Matthew's point, it is an important part of the cycle for a control freak like Steve Jobs to come around and say, forget all of this wild and woolly, Wild West freeness. We need to make a perfect product that works elegantly, that looks beautiful. And God bless him, he does it. He comes out with the iPad, he comes out with the iPhone. And then we see the cycle go the other way when other people start to enter that sphere and say, okay, he has sort of thrown the gauntlet down. Now let's make that open. Let's make that so that anybody can get into it. And now we're seeing Android devices, this open operating system. If it's not a BlackBerry and it's not an iPhone, it's running Android. And Android is the fastest growing platform.
What does that look like?
An Android phone?
Yeah.
I can show you.
Yeah. Oh, you got one? Yeah. I have not.
It's interesting that 3 out of 4 of us have Android phones. And it's partly because of the openness.
Yeah, show it to 3. That's good.
It's this is the Google phone, and it looks a lot like an iPhone.
It does.
The difference being that the operating system itself is open. Any cell phone manufacturer can use this on their phone, and anyone can write an application for it. It's still apps, like we're talking about. The trend is towards apps, but unlike the iPhone app market, where you have to get permission from Apple before you can sell your app through their service, and they take a nice hefty cut, anybody can write a piece of software.
And you know, Tim made a good point that this is a cycle that goes on, has been going on since the internet was first invented. I mean, the early days of the web, you had CompuServe and AOL and all these companies that were trying to create a walled garden, and lots of people signed up for AOL because the internet was scary. It was this huge, unfamiliar place. And AOL gave you nice-looking icons, and you've got mail.
Couldn't talk to anybody else, though.
Right. So then you saw people moving away from that once they got familiar with the internet.
Yeah.
Tim.
But I want to disagree with Jesse. I think that there may be something more fundamental going on here than just sort of a trend or a fad towards closed devices. When you look at the longer history of the media over the last 100 years, there is these longer sort of 10 or 20-year trends from open systems to closed systems. And the signs are kind of everywhere. If you look around at the internet markets, they're mostly monopolies. I mean, Google has a monopoly on search. Apple has a lot of market power.
You mean a virtual monopoly?
An actual monopoly.
An actual monopoly.
Yeah. Microsoft still has a very powerful hold on the operating systems. If you look in communications in the United States, where I'm from, AT&T is back. I don't think in Canada, I don't know if Bell Canada ever went away, but AT&T is reformed like the robot in Terminator. It kind of came back. There's only a few, there's no ISPs left. Most of the markets have consolidated in very profound ways. And you have the re-rise of the telephone, which is AT&T's old device. So there's a lot of signs that actually we're going into a more fundamental consolidation. And
Which means closed, which means...
Which means closed, which means a few companies in charge, which means essentially a return to the way, even say in broadcasting or in television, you once had 2 or 3 really big players in charge. I think we may be headed back.
There is a bit of a contradiction there, which is the relationship between an incumbent and a new entrant. Yes, we're talking about monopolies. These are monopolies that are telco monopolies, cable monopolies, new media monopolies, and they treat each other the way they don't want to be treated. They want to run a closed system where they have their monopoly, and they want everything open where they don't have a monopoly. So you have Google as this very monopolistic company that tries to use free and open source to disrupt any industry it is not in.
That's true.
And Apple similarly has a similar situation where they have their monopoly around devices, but they go after content industries, they go after application developers in a similar type of disruptive approach that is, I think, both symbiotic of open and closed, but contradictory. That again, it was interesting how you, Steve, reacted to the word monopoly, as if it was a bad word. But that's kind of what we should be talking about, because Facebook almost has a monopoly on social networking. Twitter kind of has a monopoly on microblogging. So when do we start saying, hey, maybe there should be regulation of these monopolies instead of allowing these monopolies to disrupt each other's
And
industry?
it's interesting that the phone companies, like Google's phones, because they're open, so then the phone company gets to control what goes on there. It's not like they let you put whatever you want on there. Verizon and lots of other companies, they're saying, no, you have to use our app store, or you can't put this particular app on because it'll do something we don't want you to. So the fact that you have an open device is almost, it's not worth that much to you.
Let me read something here called a Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, which I gather is an antiquated term now, cyberspace, right?
It's a pretty old document.
Yeah, nobody uses this anymore. Here we go. Well, this is from 1996. You got it. This is from Barlow. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. Hirsch. I'm only going to use last names so we don't get confused in the Jesse. Was the web ever the really wide open new frontier that its advocates claimed it would be?
No. I mean, that libertarian myth being derived from California, being derived from the same community of Wired magazine who just declared the web is dead, always served commercial purposes. And I think it's government's in the business of regulation. If they're not regulating the internet, they should be. Certainly authoritarian governments are doing this quite successfully. We're in a deficit that as a democratic society, we haven't figured out how to democratically regulate the internet. Because if we don't democratically regulate the internet, it's going to be regulated by anti-democratic forces. To me, that's straight politics 101. And the question is why we've been sticking our head in the sand since 1996 and denying the fact that it's not a frontier, it's not lawless, our laws do apply to cyberspace, and that if we don't address that reality rather than the fantasy of libertarianism, then we continue to be at a competitive disadvantage against countries who do regulate their internet.
Let's go around on this. Tim, what do you say on that?
I thought it's a great question. I think there was a period in the 90s where it was posing a serious challenge to legal systems. I'm a law professor, and there was, for the copyright law, I'll take the most obvious example. The copyright law had a series of assumptions. One is that it's hard to copy stuff. Right. And obviously the internet changed that. And I think it did pose a pretty serious challenge. And when he was writing in '96, it did feel like a lot of the legal systems were under attack that were relevant to the internet. I believe that in general, governments, as you suggested, have reasserted their authority, mainly by reasserting by the fact that ultimately there are humans underneath the internet who can be arrested and put in jail. And that is still true. And so there has been a reassertion of authority, I think. And it goes in line with this whole kind of general closing of the internet. There's a real parallel historically to radio. Radio in the 1920s was thought to be unregulatable, utopian, no one could control it. There were thousands of radio stations.
A lot of them fighting for the same frequencies.
And everyone was fighting. It was all crazy. Everyone said, this will never be tamed. It's an untamed medium. And then by 1935 in America, you had NBC had subsumed most of it. And in places like Germany, you had Hitler using the radio to drive the totalitarian state. And so, media has a way of this tendency to explode in this open way, but then be used as a tool for powerful firms and powerful governments to do what they want.
Matthew, do you see that happening, a kind of an attempt to corral this thing?
For sure. I mean, and it's definitely happening. And there are countries that are doing quite a good job of arresting people and throwing them in jail and clamping down on the internet.
Well, that we know, but what about in democracies?
Well, I think there's always that tension. It's just like the open versus closed tension. I think the potential of the web is exactly what John Perry Barlow put in his sort of hippie terms. The potential is that theoretically anyone can publish. Theoretically anyone can set up a website to do things. They can create companies. They can, but there's always that pressure from governments, from other companies, from everywhere to sort of restrict what you can do. The amazing thing to me is that even in countries like China or repressive totalitarian states, you've got people posting things to Twitter. You've got people writing things on blogs. You've got taking huge risks. But these tools and the internet in all its forms allow them to do things that they were never able to do before.
Now, I know when I listen to Search Engine, as I do from time to time, you talk to some of the decision makers up in Ottawa, and I'm wondering if you see any appetite on the CRTC to get involved in this and try to regulate the internet in Canada or the web?
Well, they're sort of struggling to catch up, and they are involved to some degree in net neutrality. They're doing their best. I think that it's a complicated topic for whether or not they have that jurisdiction and how they're going to actually exert it. But they've taken some positive steps towards keeping the net open and neutral. I think that a lot of what we're talking about here, it almost sounds as if we're discussing something that exists outside of ourselves. Is it consolidating? Is it going to be, is it a trend towards closed? Is it a trend towards open? This is something that we can actually influence. Well, if we look at how it's gone so far, and Clay Shirky has written that if you go back 10 or 15 years and take the most outlandish, hippie-ish statements from techno-optimists and techno-utopians about all the wonderful things the internet would do for society, and you put them up against all the negative claims people thought about all the horrible things it would do, the utopians win every time. I mean, it's uncanny how much of that stuff has actually come to pass. And the free and open, unregulated net that the laws and the regulatory bodies are struggling to catch up to has actually yielded some wonderful positive results. That being said, it poses some serious challenges, and there are needs. I think net neutrality is one of them. Copyright might be another, to bring the law into this and say that this isn't beyond our reach. But we can analyze this. It's not some magical force being inflicted upon us. It is just the sum of human communication, and we can make decisions about that.
Sure, but go ahead, Jesse.
I was going to say, I mean, Jesse's points reminds me of Bell's recent purchase of CTV. That on the surface, it strikes me as totally absurd that you would spend $1 billion to buy 30 channels when there's over 5 million channels. So if we consumers decide to tune in to amateur Lego Star Wars on YouTube instead of watching the Discovery Channel or instead of watching TSN, then I think that prophecy will come true, that the internet, the web, will really be the type of democratic, level playing field that a lot of the utopians promised us. Whereas if we keep tuning in to the rubbish on Much Music and on MTV every day, then we don't deserve the type of internet that we've all been promised. And it's really consumer choice that I think will directly have an impact on whether it's more of a broadcast telco universe or whether it's a type of open bazaar where anyone can have an opportunity to express themselves.
And it's interesting to note that Apple, which has always wanted to be so controlling and so dominant, even the iPhone has opened up because people were basically expressing their desire by hacking the device to put whatever they wanted on there. Apple didn't want to let you put all kinds of different apps from different companies on there.
They wanted their stuff.
They wanted to control, you can only put these things. But then eventually, people jailbroke their devices, put whatever they wanted on there. And I think someone at Apple, Steve Jobs or someone, thought, we better get in front of this, because otherwise we're going to get steamrolled.
So what'd they do?
Well, they opened it up
They
more.
did open it up.
They opened it up more.
They still curate everything.
They still
you got to go
control it.
through there,
Yeah.
and for very arbitrary reasons, they can block things.
But it's more open than Steve wanted it to be.
Well, they lost to Microsoft in the 90s. I mean, Apple could have owned operating systems, computers in the 90s. They were too closed, too controlling.
Yep.
And Microsoft came and ate their lunch, basically, with their own products. I mean, you look at Windows, it's basically a copy of Apple, a little more open.
And Google's now doing the same thing. Google's playing the Microsoft role, and Apple's still there trying to be controlling. And I've got to think there are people saying, we can't make the same mistake we did last time.
I would agree with Jesse. I think
Which one?
This Jesse. That this isn't something that happens magically. Oh, there is a lot of powerful forces that want to close the internet. I mean, there's the entire entertainment industry.
For sure.
They never like the internet. Generally, you know, I mean, it's not. It's
Well,
just
there's one channel that's trying to exploit it, right? Is it NBC who's got Hulu? They're trying to
kind of, but it's sort of halfway.
Very close.
Close.
Yeah, never
so that's
really.
and that's not the internet. Hulu is Hulu, a separate application. So they're the same way. They're trying to get people away from the web, away from YouTube, into their own environment.
Yeah, you know, New York and Hollywood have never. The phone companies, they've never really liked the internet. I mean, they've sort of said nice things about it because you need to be polite and it's new, but they don't really like that fundamental, that's a very radical kind of libertarian center that they're not comfortable with.
Threatens their empire.
It threatens the empire. And so there is, you know, leaving aside totalitarian governments, there are trillions of reasons, each of them called a dollar, to want to change the way the internet is. And that's been true for a long time.
Let me read another graphic here. This one from Tim O'Reilly from last year. Michael, board 3 if we could here. We're heading into a war for control of the web. And in the end, it's more than that. It's a war against the web as an interoperable platform. Instead, we're facing the prospect of Facebook as the platform, Apple as the platform, Google as the platform, Amazon as the platform, where big companies slug it out until one is king of the hill. And it's time for developers to take a stand. If you don't want a repeat of the PC era, place your bets now on open systems. Don't wait till it's too late. Jesse, what's he saying here?
Well, you know, it's interesting because a lot of the politics is dictated by the technology itself, and a lot of the politics of the internet, it's written into the architecture of the internet, and that's a call to arms for developers, that the politics are going to be fought by the people who write the code. And you know, you look at something like what's happened to the music industry, where they failed miserably to catch up to what was happening with file sharing on Napster. And when finally somebody came out with a model where you actually could sell this stuff, and this is not an enemy of commerce, the internet, it's a huge engine of commerce, but Steve Jobs figured it out better than the music industry could, and now they are completely dancing to Steve Jobs' tune, and they are desperate for that not to be a monopoly. The big music labels want Google to get into the music business because a monopoly doesn't benefit anyone. They want more players, they want to be able to set the prices of their own songs. So I think what is being said here is, don't make the mistake the music industry did and buy into a closed proprietary system. No matter what you do, if you're writing code, if you're trying to sell your magazine, your newspaper, your music, get involved in an open system. It'll be harder to figure out the place. The buttons aren't going to be as easy to press, and the ergonomics aren't going to be as elegant, but ultimately you will retain more control and everyone will be the better for it.
What's out there, Matthew, that competes with iTunes, if we're using the musical example, for legal file sharing where you got to pay $1 a song or something?
Well, there are a number of other solutions, but iTunes is, you know, the 900-pound gorilla.
They're the virtual monopoly.
Because they have agreements with all the record labels. So you can go to Rhapsody and you can go to, you know, half a dozen other places. But
it's Ping. I've heard of Ping.
Well, Ping is Apple's attempt to create a sort of music-based social network. But you can go to these other places, but you're not going to get all the songs you want. But you know that iTunes is probably going to have, other than the Beatles, they're probably going to have everything you want because Steve Jobs managed to cut all these deals with the big record labels. Yeah. But I think Jesse's right. They would much rather have someone else. They're basically at Apple's beck and call.
Jesse Hirsch, we've seen what China has tried to do with the internet. Certainly with Google, they're have had some difficulties as well with RIM and with BlackBerry. Do you see that as the ongoing trend, that more and more countries of, not necessarily, but probably totalitarian or authoritarian governments are going to go in that direction?
Absolutely, and I think part of it is a confidence that the internet is not the type of saboteur, the type of radical that will unwind their authority, but also a very clear consciousness that these companies want to do business, that to give them credit, they want to comply with the laws of the lands that they do business in. So as long as it seems somewhat compliant with the rule of law rather than just arbitrary authority, absolutely. And again, I think that we have had a bit of an aberration in assuming that the internet is this libertarian fantasy. It is what we make of it. I mean, it is, you know, to use a McLuhan concept, a wonderful narcissistic pool. We will see in it whatever we want to see. So an authoritarian society is going to see a newfound authoritarianism. Democratic societies, yes, want to see democratic renewal, but the Tea Party in the United States certainly questions whether such internet grassroots movements are going to be truly democratic or more akin to fantasy, more akin to a type of escapism that resembles more of a video game than practical politics. And I think the Sarah Palin presidency will confirm it. Partly because it's not, I can say that without laughing, but you know, Ronald Reagan was a very successful actor who became president. There's absolutely no reason to
I don't want
believe
to get into a debate with you about Ronald Reagan
that
and
the
Sarah
internet
Palin ought to be equivalent.
but that the internet could not create a similar contradiction that, again, appears to some as totally farce, but appears to others as a savior embodied in grassroots politics that the internet, I think, empowers.
Matthew?
I think the only thing that we have going for us, or you know, in terms of China, for example, they want to do business too. It's not just that Google wants to do business with them. And so you see with them and Google this real kind of back and forth. China tries to, you know, well, you have to filter your results. Google says, well, we're going to pull out. No, 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 don't go yet. You know, maybe we can work something out. So at least there's the potential there for Google and other companies to use what they have to kind of negotiate.
Yeah, but there's a real risk of relying on Google, a private company, to be the agency of democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's a great place. I like them. They're
Why
nice guys.
why would they be any
they're a
worse at it
company.
than some?
Well, at least in theory, you know, a government or a public organization, their goal is supposed to be exporting democracy. Google is supposed to be liable to its shareholders eventually. And so, you know, a lot of us put a lot of, sorry?
I thought they had a different mandate.
Well, they
do, kind of.
they
Do no
kind of
evil.
do. But what I mean is we are relying on private companies. And as long as that lasts, it's fine. But we're relying on private companies as being the ambassadors who are supposed to crack open China. And their interest only goes so far. You know?
Not to mention we've relied upon those same private companies to essentially set our communications policy, to set the terms by which we regulate our technology and media.
Well, because they get it, and
that's
Ottawa
always-
and Washington don't.
that's
They're
But
well
that's
behind.
that's
But
not
that's
at all
always
the
happened.
case. There are a lot of civil servants in Ottawa. There are a lot of people in the civil service in every province who get the internet. It's the politicians who don't.
Right.
And so insofar as the civil servants have to listen to the politicians, that's the problem. But to say that governments don't know what to do, they do. We're just not empowering them to do it.
Jesse Brown.
Well, I think that Tim's being very humble here because this is a great time to bring up an effort that is trying to get censorship looked at as a trade issue, which he's been involved with. That in an information economy, if a company like Google, an American company, is trying to do business in China and they're finding themselves impeded because of American policy decisions, you might get redirected to Baidu in China. Well, that's a trade issue, and you know that I think is a place where we're talking about where does regulation stand. You know, regulation can go either way, and the laws can go either way in this space. And we just heard last week the New York Times covered this story of they broke open the story where on copyright grounds, political organizations that were at odds with the PRC were getting raided for having bootlegged Microsoft software in their computers. So with Microsoft's involvement, people, you know, the cops are showing up and stealing your computer and saying, we hear tell that there's bootleg software on this. So copyright can be used as a totalitarian tool, or it can be used to protect information.
Understood. Somebody mentioned Clay Shirky earlier, and we've got a quote from him, so we should read that here, because Clay Shirky should be a part of any discussion like this. Here we go. It's easy to say preserve the best of the old and combine it with the best of the new. But in revolution, the best of the new is incompatible with the best of the old. It's about doing things a whole new way. Okay, if we're talking about a revolution, and it sounds like he is, Matthew, what's this revolution look like?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think the revolution looks a lot like it has in the past. I think that the trends that we've seen, that back and forth between open and closed, is going to continue. And at the moment, you've got a powerful force in Apple with powerful friends try and close things down. I happen to believe that open will win.
Why do, Tim, people always use words like revolution and destruction and that kind of thing?
I think it goes back
about
to
this?
Jesse. It's more exciting to talk
way
about
more
things that way.
Yeah.
I do think there has been a revolution. The 90s is what I think is the most revolutionary period. I think we're in that crucial moment where in any revolution where you find out whether what's going to happen and where you know, this happens with political revolutions. You know, the Chinese Revolution in '48, we're talking about China, and then you have the Cultural Revolution, which is an effort to kind of lock it down. And scary things happen about 10 years after a revolution. French Revolution, America. There's this sort of turning period where you decide whether it's going to last or whether it's going to turn into a kind of a dictatorship of some kind. And even Google is dangerous here. I like Google. I like everyone. I use it every day. But Google sometimes is so religiously behind the open principle that I think they think any means justifies that end. That is, their own power is necessary to keep the world open. And you can see how that has a danger where Google becomes the guarantor of everything.
Well, and it strikes me as rather flippant that we use this word revolution. I mean, I kind of snicker when I see these iPad ads, and I wonder, okay, which government is Apple overthrowing? Like, let's take this word seriously. And maybe Tim's point about Google is right. Maybe Google really is overthrowing governments around the world, in which case these governments, out of any sense of self-preservation, should be doing something about it.
Well, they are to BlackBerry, that's for sure.
Or even amongst ourselves, do we really want to overthrow the Canadian government? Okay, granted, the current one perhaps,
Well,
but let's take it literally. Is this a revolution in which governments are being overthrown? I don't think so.
We were having such a nice nonpartisan discussion.
Well, in which case, maybe there's a better word we should be using, because revolution is, again, one of these libertarian myths that's perhaps not accurate.
I got 30 seconds left for my TVO colleague here. Do you ever see the rate of all this slowing down? It seems to all be happening so fast all the time.
Everything has changed and nothing has changed. When you compare this to other things in the past, the telephone or the car that completely transformed cities, have things changed that much? We have this idea that something comes, a new invention, and the past is done and the future is upon us. The past and the present, it all coexists for a while, and they all kind of rely on each other. These new things that are happening need to be informed by the values that we care about from the past, and there are some things that are changing for the best that, you know, I think we are well rid of some of the centralization of communication and media power that existed before.
Mr. Search Engine gets the last word. Well said. Tim Wu, Columbia University, author of The Master Switch. Jesse Hirsch, the Internet Strategist. Thanks, guys, for being here very much, and safe back to New York for you, Tim.
Thank you.
Matthew Ingram, the senior writer from GigaOM. Jesse Brown-Hurst, Search Engine, the host of Search Engine. I can say it. There we go. Thanks so much to you guys as well.
Thanks.